Okay, so tariffs. So tariffs are kind of the popular policy to stop trade, but they generally have negative effects on growth. They're a classic example of a policy. One of my favorite quote in the entire world is policy outcomes don't care about policy intentions. Just because you intend to do something with a policy does not mean it'll be its outcome. Oftentimes there are unintended consequences, and policies have the reverse outcome than their intent. Maybe not the case with tariffs, but they typically have negative outcomes. Even though their intentions are often to help domestic industry, they often have the reverse effect. Okay, so classic example, and I mentioned this up top, is ISI um, in Latin America, which was a dominant growth policy through the 20th century. Okay, and essentially the idea was, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to put up tariffs to protect our domestic industries. So we're going to put these tariffs up, protect our domestic industries, because right now our domestic industries can't compete with the big multinationals from Europe and the U.S. and Asia. Like those countries multinationals have had time to really grow and become super competitive, and our domestic industries just can't compete. So what we need is to push pause for a second, let our domestic industries grow up, and once they're ready to compete, we'll put the tariffs down, and they'll be competitive on the global market. Um, Now, so they produce gains initially, like you put the tariffs up and your domestic industry flourish. But oftentimes what happens is you end up with a domestic monopoly. So you end up with one company dominating the industry. That company is buddies with the government and kind of gets preferential treatment from the government. So you're confusing here industrialization, kind of the growth of the industry with the industrialists, the specific company or individual running the industry. All right. So oftentimes there's like a small group of elites in these countries. The person who runs the domestic monopoly, the domestic beer monopoly, or whatever the domestic clothing monopoly is buddies. They went to school with the president or the treasury minister, and they're able to get preferential treatment for their company. And essentially, they dominate the market. And if you have a monopoly, whether it's state run or whether it's run by private industry, they essentially usually almost always become inefficient because they don't face competition. So you're not facing any competition that's going to drive you to become more efficient, lower your cost, or innovate. So every time you see a monopoly, whether it's state run or run by private industry, they are typically highly inefficient. And so that's what happens in many of these Latin American countries throughout the 20th century. They protect their domestic industry from foreign competitors. The domestic industry is usually dominated by one or two firms. These firms, now that they don't face foreign competition, the idea was, hey, they'll grow and get better, and they'll eventually be able to compete with the foreigners. The reverse happens. They become big, lumbering, inefficient firms. And if they ever do have to compete with foreigners, they essentially can't, because they haven't been innovating for 20 or 30 years, and they are behind the competition. So the ultimate result of these policies is stagnation. Okay, and you can kind of see this in your Latin American countries here as they lag behind, their counterparts from other countries which saw fantastic growth. Your Asian tigers took a different policy, where essentially the government, instead of protecting the domestic industries, essentially gave them subsidies. Said, we're going to give these loans out or invest in our domestic industry, but we're not going to shield them from competition. Okay, essentially what's happening is they're helping their domestic industries without picking the winners. What happened in Latin America is essentially saying this company is going to win. This is the company we're going to favor, and this will be our company that does whatever this industry is. Where the Asian tigers are essentially, the government was like, we're just going to give this money to our domestic industries. Whoever is the best whoever innovates, we're still going to have competition with among our domestic industries. And our domestic industries will have this unfair advantage in that they're getting money from the government, but they're still subject to foreign competition. And so they're still subject to those competitive market forces that are forced them to going to become more innovative, and ultimately lead to them being highly competitive on the global market. If you're thinking of China is a similar policy where you can criticize them for what they're doing with their currency. Essentially, that's a subsidy to their domestic producers, and in most cases, their domestic producers are still competing with one another and getting getting that level of competition that ultimately leads them to be competitive on the global market. Okay, all right. This is just another way of looking at them. As you can see there, the share of world exports are falling due to this ISI policy. Most recently, if we go to the U.S., this is kind of a fun case study. It's anecdotal, but it's real fun. And so there's a Colorado company called Head. They invest in a Chinese factory to kind of manufacture their tennis balls. Trump puts these tariffs in. And essentially, these tariffs affect Head, this tennis ball manufacturing company, because their factory is in China, and so essentially they have to pay these tariffs, even though they're an American company. Their factory is in China, and so they have a sales decline. They lay off a large part of their workforce, and so the company that benefits from Head having to pay these tariffs is Wilson. Now, Wilson manufactures its tennis balls in Thailand, so it doesn't have to pay these tariffs. They manufacture them in Thailand. Who owns Wilson? Anta, a Chinese company. So the ultimate beneficiary of this particular tariff was a Chinese company, while U.S. workers, the people who worked for Head, were the people that were harmed. I mean, this kind of illustrates how interconnected the global economy is, where it's like an American company manufacturing in China, and we have a Chinese company manufacturing in Thailand, selling in the US. They're both kind of selling in the US. And so these things are highly connected when as we are in the 21st century. And so kind of a blanket tariff policy like this ends up harming a US company. And you see this with a lot of these tariffs that have been enacted recently. Ultimately, the people that oftentimes get harmed by the tariff is American companies who are either buying the inputs, or the American companies face retaliatory tariffs from China, and now they can't sell stuff in China. And so this is just a fabulously connected world now. And ultimately, the tariffs, noble policy, or the intention is to help American companies, oftentimes ends up with that unintended consequence of hurting American companies. Okay, so we have this summarized lecture. Trade is the engine of economic growth. There will be winners and losers. Like with all economic growth, you're going to have winners and losers. Innovation, by definition, creates losers as it creates winners. The losses in the U.S. were particularly acute for these like old industrial cities in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and the rural South, and led to death of despair. We don't really have a good policy to deal with this. As we show, the tariff policy is not ideal to handle these trade shocks, and it's kind of an open question as to what is the best policy to kind of deal, or how do we treat the losers of global trade. Now, the good news is the China shock was a one-time thing. There's no country as large as China that's going to come online in the way that China did that would affect the U.S. adversely, like China did. So we may be through the worst of this, although knock on wood, who knows? It's always dangerous to say we may be through the worst of something. And so who knows? Maybe, with India developing quite rapidly, maybe we'll see another trade shock on the level of the China shock. All right, end of trade. Next up, top 5 inventions, 20th century.